There are many voices in the community.
Some are black.
Some are blue. This is blackandbluevoices.com.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you may be coming from, this is the Black and Blue Voices podcast. My name is Brandon Bridges. I will be guiding you along this journey with the help of our wonderful producer, Mike Wilkerson. To my left, I've got the chief, the one and only, Chris Giuseppe. Chief, you want to say hi?
The lucky it's the one and only. I tell you what, I don't know that I could live with myself. But glad to be here, Brandon. Excited about this show.
Oh, likewise. And to my right, the always deadly Eric Alexander.
Happy to be here. Always deadly.
Hopefully I don't change that. So really, for all of our audiences out there, the point of this podcast is to get some individuals from various communities, Chief being our resident expert in all things policing and law enforcement. And then, Eric Alexander here on my right being, expert in really all things hand-to-hand combat and having a very rich perspective within the African-American community. I'm just here to tag along and throw some jokes along the way, maybe challenge each one of them. And Mike will be our genius behind the keyboard, keeping us all on track.
I have absolutely no responsibility here whatsoever.
I think Mike's going to chime in on
just 12 buttons.
Right, exactly.
Everybody says that.
Little comic relief from Mike too. So,
well, here, we like to have the hard conversations. Before I kick off, I'm often reminded of something that Chief said during a lunch we had, and really the whole point of this is to have a, check your feelings at the door conversation about the hard things.
Sure.
And I think this can provide perspective and help bridge that gap between all of the communities. We work hand in hand, we live hand in hand. Best thing for us to do is be one people.
Right. So I agree.
So with that, I want to kick off. Chief, please give me a little background about, your experience, what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in law enforcement. This is my 34th year. I've been in administration for, 22 years, something like that. I've been police chief for 8 years. I just had a long career and a lot of different experiences and such. Glad to be here. When we sat down, we had a group called Stand United that represented the African-American community, came through a lot of things here, because we're in the St. Louis region, came through a lot of things here, between 2014, we had Ferguson, and we had civil unrest, and we had George Floyd, things like that. And the Stand United group, we're going to get our guys on from Stand United to kind of tell that story where we came together, sat down and talked, and, kind of made me realize that, with anything, even aside from, police and the black community or police and minority communities, if people can't sit down and talk, you don't get anything done. And that's really why it's of interest. Because I've had people say, "Oh, you can't get on a show. You can't sit down and talk about that. Oh my gosh, it's going to be inflammatory. It's going to be." I'm like, I just want to sit down and talk, because I can tell you that law enforcement in general, just knowing law enforcement wants to be bonded with community. See, community policing doesn't work unless you have the community and the police coming together and trying to accomplish the mission of keeping everybody safe, of protecting neighborhoods, protecting schools, protecting your business districts. And the overwhelming majority of community doesn't want to be victimized, right? They don't want to be victims of crime. And the police want to protect against that. So we have common goals. And I just, it's trying to wrap my head around why can't we sit down and just chat about those things? Why can't we educate ourselves on some things, get some perspective, and move forward, get some things accomplished?
Love that. We'll try not to get you in any hot water here.
Oh, I've been in police work. We're, hot water comes and goes. That's the way it is.
Nice. And then to my right, I will always refer to him as Eric Alexander. Just never by the first name. Just got to really get that emphasis there.
Yeah, I was like, feel free. That's my name. Initial thing. I would even go a step further than what Chief just said. Law enforcement can't do its job without community engagement, I would argue.
Right. No, I agree with that. Yeah. It's,
Um,
we're successful based on the relationship we have with communities.
Right.
We all recognize that. And that's why we need that.
And I'm not going to reiterate kind of the point we've both articulated, that we're all here for the same reason. Right. Like, to me, thinking about it from the community perspective, the Black community, I would argue, needs policing more than anybody, right? Because communities of color tend to be disproportionately affected by violence. So this idea that communities of color don't need effective policing, to me, is crazy, right?
Agreed.
So, and piggyback on everything and co-sign everything the chief just said. We have to work together to bring our communities up, and if we don't, we're going to continue to stay in this no man's land where we're battling each other, distrustful of each other, etc. We're all kind of plain spoken folks in the
Right.
studio, right? We're not afraid to get in there.
Right.
And we're all intellectually honest, so we can have these conversations in ways, even when we disagree.
Right.
We can have these conversations in ways that are constructive. Professionally, I'm a clinical researcher. I've worked in healthcare. I've worked at the bedside. Now I drive a laptop. My job's to know things, so I apply that to how I approach just about everything. So I kind of try to start with what's demonstrably true, which helps, I think, in these conversations. Even though Chief makes fun of me,
I didn't.
too statistically driven.
Right.
But
Mr. Stat.
I want to start with what we know, right? Let's start there. If everybody started there, I don't think we'd be where we are rhetorically in this country. But I'm also a founder and director of Applied Combatives Group, which is where I met Chief. We do martial arts, knife defense, self-defense, teach defensive tactics. We work with law enforcement quite a bit.
Right.
And Chief trains with us. So that's how we got acquainted. And we started having these conversations with some guitars in our lap. And we're like,
That's
you know
right.
what?
Stress relief.
We need to talk about this stuff on wax. Right. So here we are. Happy
Right.
to be here.
Absolutely.
Excited about it.
Well, you both, I'm going to just jump right into it. You both said something that I thought resonates well, right? Police need the community, and police and community need the police.
Right.
It's a symbiotic relationship.
Right.
I'm going to jump to you, Mr. Eric Alexander. I'd like to get your perspective on what that's like, or if you've been in a situation where you don't feel that support, from the policing in that community. What does that emotionally, what does that look like? Whether it's good cops or no cops, right? Your own vigilance, in those areas or during that time. And then afterwards, Chief, I'm going to kick you the same question.
Sure.
Yeah. Man, I think there's a sort of, so I work with police. I have friends who are police. I'm still terrified of police interactions.
Okay.
Still to this day.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. And I think there's something, when we talk about hypervigilance, which is the word you just used, there's a generational aspect to this, right? So growing up Black in America, you are taught how to deal with police interactions and all these things. So not all of that changes with the times. I think we're in a time of, I'll say, pretty dramatic change, right? Especially with respect to law enforcement, the relationship with the community. We've seen how the last 10 years have looked in terms of the ebb and flow of social change as it accounts for these things. I think what I try to do is make a distinction between police, and I'm going to use an example that Chief uses all the time, which white cop pulls Black person over, and both people are sitting in their car thinking,
I don't want to be here.
everybody's terrified, right? So, and I think that is, it's going to sound a little bit ridiculous on its face, but I think that's progress.
Okay.
Because everybody is now willing to acknowledge that this is a little bit of a tricky situation, right?
Yeah.
And that both the Black person in that car and the white cop in that car, I think the next step is to realize that the other person is feeling the same way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think as we go along in these things, I mean, I could share stories about you know, situations in my own family that haven't gone great. But, you know, you just never know. From the perspective of the black person in that car, I'm like, okay, is this going to be a good interaction? Is this going to be a bad interaction? Like who, because regardless, we talk about most cops are good people who don't want any problems, who aren't racist. I don't call people racist in general, unless it's really obvious that they're racist. I'll call out behaviors as racist. I'll call out attitudes as racist, but I try not to label the whole person. But most of the time, it's not somebody who's gonna be a problem. But the chance that it is not zero.
Correct. Yeah.
And if it is, the stakes of that interaction for both parties is very high.
Well,
Right. So that's what people are afraid of.
No, that's a great segue, Chief.
So-
I want to hear.
Yeah. So, well, where to start? So, you know, like Eric said, you know, it's trying to get perspectives from both, from different, you know, angles. And when, you know, when you guys say, hey, you know, we're taught from an early, so I don't have that experience, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. When you have a marked police car out there and I'm a police officer and I pass a marked police car, ooh, I look at my speedometer. I'm just going to say, everybody, it's innate in you because at 16 years old, I was not a police officer.
Correct.
So when I pass, and that's what's supposed to happen, that innate deterrent. Oh my gosh, am I speeding? No, okay. Oh, look, I'm a little bit over. Okay, I need to slow down. Whatever.
You're never
So-
over the speed.
So you,
For the record, Chief is the slowest driver in America.
Eric's always on me because I am hey, I'm safety first. Okay.
Eric is not the only one that will get on you about driving slow.
So anyway, all of you, yes, and all of you speed demons out there, you know, everybody in the room, including not Brandon. I don't want to indict him, but
Like, my man, see, that's what I'm thinking about.
anyway. So, but yeah, you have that feeling. But I remember, you know, talking to some of our other guys, you know, where they said, yeah, I'm absolutely terrified, you know, because I'm African-American guy pulled, I'm absolutely terrified. I'm like, I can't relate to that. I mean, yeah, I hope everything goes well. You know, I mean, it's not like I'm worried about the interaction. I've never had an experience, young or old, where I've been pulled over and thought something bad's going to happen to me. Now, since we're given perspectives here, I want to give you a perspective of pulling somebody over. Have I ever been afraid and in fear when I'm pulling somebody over? Yeah. And irrelevant of the race of the person or the background, because I don't know when I'm going up to that car necessarily, unless I've tried to figure out who the driver is, tried to run them, so on and so forth. But yeah, that fear going up on a traffic stop is real. I mean, it's, and let's face it, if you take two people who are in fear, it's just it's not a good combination right off the bat.
Absolutely.
So, when we go back to, because a lot of, you know, people talk about, what about, you know, officer involved shootings, this and that. What's the basis, Mike Wilkerson, of utilizing lethal force? What's justification for lethal force?
Well, it's contextual, which I know everyone hates to hear that answer. It depends. The concept of depends is huge inside of podcasting, and it's huge inside of life.
Yeah.
And lethal force is an absolutely it depends context.
Yeah. And
The want for everyone to be able to paint things instantly black and white, by the way, right now, I need the answer right now, is something that is what impacts cops on the regular.
Right.
And what's funny too is the conversations and experiences that Eric is talking about are very much in a line in the same mental perspective that the cops are going through when they're both being pulled over. It's
Right.
it's exactly the same experience.
and that's exactly my point. And Mike, being a little bit about Mike, he teaches concealed carry, knows a lot about firearms and protecting yourself and things like that. And if you're going to use lethal force, you need to be in imminent fear of death or serious physical injury. But it's fear, right?
Yeah.
So taking two people who are afraid, it's a dicey, right? It's a dicey combination as it is.
Also, the context of consequence.
Right.
It's the piece that I
But
always
fear, that's still fear,
It
right?
is, and again, the piece of, we talk about this all the time when we talk about concealed carry, is the force continuum, the use of force continuum inside of concealed carry.
Right.
It's all there. It's all
Right.
painted in pictures, but you have to also remember that everything changes the instant you want to engage any of it.
Right. Yeah, it's dynamic, and sometimes you only have a second or so to figure it out.
And critically subjective.
Right. It is critically subjective. Absolutely. We'll get into that later on when we talk about, criminal justice and the system and things like that. I mean, it's just, but yeah, so as far as when we start talking about hypervigilance, we there is in police work, there's actually a book out there by a guy named Kevin Gilmartin. Love the book. Is the name of it's Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And if you ever want to read a book that takes you into the mind of a cop, how police think, I found that book to be absolutely accurate. But there's a term in there called hypervigilance where you're vigilant all the time. It's actually unhealthy for you. It's physically unhealthy for you. And police go through this hypervigilance because you're always on edge. You're always ready for this, this lethal force encounter or some type of encounter. It elevates all of your, I don't know. And I'll have to defer to the medical expert here. Your, I guess, adrenaline level,
Fight or flight.
and things like that. And it actually pushes you into a mode where you're, you're very alert, but you're also very, your senses are just heightened so much. But what happens is when you stop, when you're off duty, that starts to come down to a normal level. But because you've used up so much energy, it drags you down below a normal level. And they found, look, we got an 80% divorce rate in law enforcement. Our suicide rate is 3 times the national average. It's a real thing. I think that there was a statistic too, because you tell me if this is wrong medically, but it also makes you produce cortisol, I think it was.
Inflammatory hormone.
And I think that over a career of police work, I think the rate of diabetes is like 80% or something like that because of this overproduction of cortisol.
It's your stress hormone.
That
Yes.
stores fat, and right.
So let me ask you guys this, Mr. Eric Alexander, you and I had probably a lot of those same conversations growing up,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, it is a part of our community. It is a part of, how we raise our children and kind of the reality of a lot of what our previous generations have gone through.
Sure.
Chief, you talking about, head on a swivel, that hypervigilance, being in the Marines, walking patrols, you
Right.
have that hypervigilance, 5.5s and 25s. You're looking at the ground, the sky, every window.
Right.
So, I understand both of these perspectives, but I guess my question, if we're going to ask ourselves honestly, it's a very honest conversation here, how much of that is bias that we carry into that, right? So, and I'll tee you up first. We have that conversation at 16. I never have an interaction with the cop, and then all of a sudden I get pulled over.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I have to go off of is, well, I'm told that I may be shot.
Yeah.
I'm told that I may be dragged out the car. I'm told that I'm, all of these things. So how much does that carry into, in your opinion, that bias carry into? Are we setting ourselves up in a way for failure?
You're hitting the thing, man. So
You're hitting the thing.
hitting the thing.
It must be good. It must be bad. We don't know.
Well,
But you hit it.
This is the thing. But this piggybacks perfectly off of what Chief was talking about. And I actually have done some reading on police stress, and I've done some reading on stress in the African American community, and they're so similar. Right. And you talked about that cortisol, and you're not only cortisol, but you're adrenalized during work. You get off your shift and it bottoms out and you crash.
Right.
And in the worst cases, it doesn't. And they just stay to the extent they can. They stay in a heightened emotional state.
Well, they go back to, so what happens is you crash.
Yeah.
You're off, you're around your family, but you crave getting back up there. So you go back to work.
So you
on your day off, or you're calling about a case on your day off, or whatever, and that becomes your entire world and identity. Well, why is the divorce rate 80%?
That's right.
Why is the suicide rate 3 times the national average? I mean, because that's your identity. Survival in our profession revolves around not making that your entire identity, right? So like me, at 34 years, in my opinion, I'm identified by my faith, my family, other things. I have
healthier
I have other
aspects.
things. A lot of times career law enforcement will start cutting those things out of their life, and all they have left is the job. The job won't be there for you forever.
Well, that fits with the stereotypes you'll see on TV, right? Like the cop who works hard and has no life, and they get up, go to the office, you know, the 24/7, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we see on TV.
And sometimes that's accurate.
So let me draw a parallel here. So because we talked about 5 times the rate of depression among cops, higher rates of suicide,
Right.
higher rates of divorce, and all that stems from, and we haven't even talked about the shift work aspect of this,
Right.
which is a physiological stress in itself. You look at people
Right.
who work third shift have higher mortality than people who work first shift.
Right.
That's demonstrated, right? So let's flip that over and look at Black people. But the context here is not work, it's generational trauma, right? And this is the thing you're hitting on, Brandon, which is there's some evidence. We don't really understand epigenetics. Epigenetics is how your DNA changes under stress, but there's actually a fair amount of data, particularly in animals, that if you have stressed parents, they pass along altered DNA to their children. So there is evidence for the physiological DNA evidence of passing along generational trauma. And that's been reproduced over and over and over again. So I regard that as true, right? But what you were just talking about, the thing you were hitting on, Brandon, was this idea among Black people, a lot of times it's called trauma porn, which for those of you in the audience who aren't familiar, and Chief, I don't know if you...
I'm not familiar.
Right?
You have to educate me here.
Have you heard of this, trauma porn?
No.
So it's exactly what Brandon was talking about, which is you're told stories. We pass along generational trauma through stories. So I'll give you a story about myself. My best friend in the world, who I grew up down the street from, literal best friend since 3rd grade. He's a white guy. And he's family to me, right? And he and his wife came to St. Louis for a weekend, 4 or 5 days, and just hung at our house. And we cooked and we went out and went out, listened to music. We just had a great time. We were cooking one night and we needed something from the store. And he and I jump in the car, run around the corner. We get, I don't know, a bag of lemons, something insignificant, right? It was $3 or $4 worth of stuff. And we went to the self-checkout. I checked out, I paid, and we start to walk off. I turn around and I grab a receipt. And I walk back and he's like, we get in the car and he's like, why'd you go back for that receipt? It was like $3.99 or whatever it was. And I was like, as a Black person in America, you never leave a store without a receipt.
Just taught my kids that lesson not even a year ago.
Never leave a store without a receipt. And I was taught that, right? And all the blood drained out of his face. And he's like, I've known you for almost 40 years. And I've never, ever considered that. Right. So it was a really telling moment of putting himself in my shoes. Is like, man, no, that's stuff I never even have to think about. Right.
Right.
So that's just an example. Now you could describe that as vigilance, protecting your children.
Yeah.
You can also describe that as trauma porn too.
Right. Yeah. And that's what we were taught.
But they don't exclude each other. Right. One of the things that I function on, I try to convince people, is more than one thing can be true.
Yes.
Both of those things can be true. But what that does is, in your example, Brandon, of you're 16, you've never had a law enforcement interaction, you've never driven a car, and you get pulled over at 16, what informs your perspective on that interaction is what you've been taught.
Yeah.
You've been taught that yes sir, no sir, police, and a lot of people are taught police can kill you at these interactions, right? Like we will never see you again. That, and there's different, obviously there's a spectrum of how people phrase it, but it instills fear in the child.
Yeah.
Now, there's a practicality to that, which I'm not suggesting that people don't teach their children this, but the side effect of it is it's programming you to when you are pulled over, you're under stress. Right. And that's the trauma porn aspect. But what I want to parallel is everything we've talked about with police and stress. This creates stress, intergenerational stress in Black people. But instead of it manifesting as stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, divorce, those things that show up in cops, all those things are true in Black people as well. But the difference is Black people have their sense of self formed around the idea of being Black, where, Chief, you don't have your sense of self formed around being, when you're 20, your sense of self didn't develop around the idea of being a police officer. That comes later in your life, and you eventually take that uniform off.
Right.
Right. But lack of self-esteem or side effects of that, learned helplessness, where you ain't gonna amount to nothing, right? Like everybody around you's broke, everybody around you's, whatever, struggling. You learn helplessness in that, chronic emotional fatigue, stress, chronic illness. If you look at the rates of diabetes in Black people, chronic kidney disease, heart failure, cardiovascular disease, they're all higher than comparison groups. And that is that cortisol effect, Chief, that you were talking about,
right.
And the effects of chronic stress, and from a sociological standpoint, self-hate, racism, right?
Yeah, that's actually something I was going to bring.
So these are really complicated things, but to kind of bring it back, and I'm going to lay my plane because Brandon's budgeting. I am going on a little bit, but I think this is important. The point that I'm making is that both groups are suffering from the same thing.
Right.
But they don't see it in each other.
Same disease.
And if you can see it in each other, you can be like, listen, look at each other like, look, man, we're all going home. We're like 10 and 2. We're not going to have any problems here. I just want you to know, because traffic stops are dangerous for cows.
They are.
Period. Right. In any case. Right. So I think that's one of the goals here, is to get people thinking about, hey, we're more alike than different in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I wanted to phrase this. Sorry, same question. I just want to phrase it a little different, because I think Sir Eric Alexander, amazing point. I can resonate with that, right?
Sure.
It's something that a perspective I've lived. On the other side, military, law enforcement, whatever you may be in that sphere.
Yeah.
You obviously carry biases just through human life interaction, right? Before you become a cop, you're a human first, right?
Right.
You live, you learn.
And you're still a human once you become a cop too.
So I want my question to you would kind of be
shocking, right?
And I'm not asking for specific examples, but how have you seen those biases, whether positive or negative, play out within law enforcement as you've moved through the ranks?
Well, I think it's a good point of being human. I like, bringing that point up, because when we talk about just people in general, whether they're police officers or not police officers, we're the same as everybody else in some aspects, because we do have this humanity to us. Some people think not. But we do have this humanity to us. And Eric, name the person who doesn't have a bias.
Not possible.
All right, not possible.
Inside of a human experience.
Inside of a human experience. Everybody has a bias. You build up these biases based on what your experience is, right?
That's all we.
So police are no different, but they, it's just like if you're the 16-year-old kid, African-American kid, and you've never ever been pulled over by the police, but you get pulled over one time and you have a bad experience. That's your perspective, right? It's true with police too.
Yeah.
So if you're in community and you have problem with, and this will go to a longer talk, but I mean, if you're in a predominantly minority community, right? Could you build up a bias because you can go, well, every time I deal with the minority community, this is what happens. What you're not seeing is, you're only dealing with 5% or whatever of any group that's committing crime. The 95% that aren't, you're not dealing with.
And you're not supposed to.
And my point to further my point, if I take a detective that's down in a major urban area that has a lot of crime, and that detective is assigned to child sex offenses, and we say and believe me, they've been in that for 10 years. They have some trauma.
Yeah.
They're going to have some trauma. Absolutely. But if I say to them, hey, what do you think about ministers? Oh, pedophiles. What do you think about priests? Oh, pedophile. What do you think about scout leaders? Oh, pedophile. What about teachers? I could go on and on. Their experience is everybody they come across is a pedophile. Now, do you think you're going to build up a bias?
Absolutely.
You're going to be jaded. And this is the danger that we as police officers get into, we can become jaded against everybody, right? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
everybody I deal with is bad. I say this because I know this because I've been there. 17 years into the job, I've been doing it for 34 years, but I'm telling you, 17 to 20 years into the job, I started getting really jaded, really bad, to the point where I'm like, I've just given up on people. I just can't stand them. Because all I saw was this. What you have to do is you have to branch out. Like I said, my faith is what drives me. And I can tell you that when I started reaching out and I started talking to people, get yourself involved with community, other communities, the faith-based community. And I have found a common thread. I don't care if it's the African-American community and the police community, that common thread of faith, spirituality, belief.
Yes.
That's what's I've found bonded me together with a lot of different people and a lot of different community members. But that bias is real. We all have it. And Eric's pointing out the similarities between the police community, the African-American community, and some of the things that we struggle with. We struggle with the same things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Humans struggling with the same things.
Right.
And I want to ask though, because if I'm going to be honest with myself and everyone out here in the world, and as we all should be, there are times that my bias has helped me. If I'm going to be frank, right? There are times where I've seen someone, and not because they were black, white, green, blue, whatever, but because of their mannerisms, because of, hey, I know people who tuck their hand in their hoodies like that typically aren't up to something, whatever it may be, right? That bias has allowed me to just remove myself holistically from a situation or my family, or preemptively, whatever it may be, to not incur the chance of something happening.
Well, I mean, when I get pulled over, I put my hands on the steering wheel. You want to know why?
Too slow.
For driving too slowly. If I ever get pulled over for driving too slowly, I throw my hands up on the steering wheel because I want them to see my hand. Because you want to know why? Because I know what it's like walking up on that car and not seeing somebody's hands.
Yeah.
It will invoke fear. So I want the police officer to know, hey, here's my hands. I'm not, feel more comfortable. I want that to go down. But I never had a fear of, oh my gosh, I might be shot and killed on this traffic stop. I haven't had that. And that's where
You're doing it as a courtesy to the officer that's walking up to
and safety. Right.
Yeah.
And it's perspective. And that's why when I talk to Eric and Eric explained these things to me, I've never had that experience, but I want to listen.
Yeah.
I want to hear it. And I want him to listen and hear the other side of it too. And that's why we're here.
Well, and I do the same thing, and having trained with cops over the years and talks with chief. I mean, after you guys remember Philando Castile?
Oh, that is one that I remember as a concealed carry holder.
I am too. I'm also a concealed carry holder, and I remember when Philando Castile hit the news, the news waves. Is that a word? News waves?
Yeah.
But it was probably 2:00 in the afternoon, and I remember, my wife called me hysterical.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who don't know, really briefly, Philando Castile was a black man, concealed carry holder in Minneapolis, I think. Yeah. And he was pulled over. He had his girlfriend and daughter in the car, 2-3-year-old girl, and a young cop, knew, like barely out of the rolling with an older cop. He was out there on his own and freaked out. Right. And he asked him, he's complying with everything. He doesn't get out of the car, nothing like that. And he asked him for his license and registration. He disclosed to the officer that he was carrying. He was a licensed concealed carry holder. He asked for his license. He reached back, it was in his pocket, and he shot him, killed him.
I remember that.
And so after that, my wife calls, she's hysterical. Like, that could have been you kind of thing. Right. So that's what we think about in these situations. But since then, 10 and 2. Well, even before that, but especially now, 10 and 2, if I get pulled over and my wallet goes on in my center console. So I never have to reach back toward my body. Right. So we have to think about these things.
I think about those things too, just because I've been on the other side of it. And I don't want to startle anybody.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. It's just, it's perspective, right?
Yeah, I think that what we see there with the Philando, and I want to get actually Mike's thoughts on this before we segue, but just to put a pin in this, it brings up the question as a community, are we choosing the wrong martyrs? Because very few people do know about Philando Castile.
Yeah.
A lot of them know about Michael Brown. So I want to put a pin in that. Mike, love to get your perspective, thoughts, feedback on just how you were raised with police interaction and what that looks like for you today as you get pulled over.
We've gone over this a little bit inside of Cops and Robbers Talk, and I was absolutely a wayward child.
Mike drives really fast, by the way, too. Just saying.
Mike, everybody drives fast to you.
13 years old, I found a very wonderful teacher in my middle school named Mr. Isaacson and Detective Cooper. And both of them helped me to understand that if I didn't change things, I would be going in a completely different direction. Inside of Cops and Robbers Talk, we talk specifically about how mentorship and the legendary stories that you grow up with, either from family or friends or just the atmosphere in which you grow up in. It's incredibly valuable, but it can also take you down a path errantly very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So growing up, I had an absolute endearment for cops, no question. But I also like to find my way around where I didn't have to interact with them.
Yeah.
I had absolutely no aversion to police, but to authority. Oh yeah.
So if you get pulled over today, we leave here, you get pulled over.
Which is real.
And I do, by the way.
Which is real possible. He's on the speeding watch list.
Do you feel like, whether the actions are the same, do you feel like, your intent of maybe you put your hands on the wheel, do you feel like that comes from more of, the negative stories and experience you hear, or from like what Chief was saying, more of that recognition of, hey, I walk these are the shoes that they're walking.
Yeah. This is a really great question because I drive a dark Dodge Charger. It is.
So they assume you're black.
It's the antenna inside of a police car instantly go up when I drive by. It's the way it works.
Yep.
And I knew that when I bought the car. But yeah, all of the windows go down. The radio goes down. I pull my car over. I turn the car off. I turn the wheels into wherever the embankment is, so they're all turning in. I pull up my driver's license, my concealed carry card, and my proof of insurance are in my hand. And hello, how are you, officer? And now we go. And I've never had any issue. And it's the awareness piece. It's the having that common respect that I hope and just pray that this program helps to foster, regardless of the side on which we're on.
That's right. Yeah.
The one is for the information flow to happen. Inside of the Crisis Cop podcast over at crisiscop.com, we talk regularly about the game that's played inside of cop interaction, especially traffic stops, where the games have to go out the window. It's very plain. It's very straightforward. There has to be a common respect between both sides. And when there isn't, that's what you see on, say, YouTube.
Yeah.
Or the stories that you get inside of your legendary stories when you're brought up inside of your atmosphere.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up. And that goes to a good point. I can tell you that I have seen, and you guys won't see this. You won't see this, but I have seen interactions where we've had people, African-American people, suspects, go, hey, look, you're not going to have any problems out of me. I'm not going to give you any reason. And I've had the police officer go, thank you. You want to know why? Because both of them are high alert, maybe in some fear, anxiety at that time. And that's two people interacting and going, look, I got to do my job. And the other person going, I understand. You're not going to have any problems out of me. Physically say that. And the police officer say, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And that interaction goes on. There's, in police work, I always go back to, look, we treat everybody, we try to treat everybody and should treat everybody with dignity and respect. And that's gonna bring us a long way. I'm sure over at Crisis Cops, they talk about that at length because that's how you establish rapport. That's how you avoid.
No, not only that, the
bad
thing
interaction
about inside of crisis negotiation is that it's about slowing things down.
Right.
Yeah.
Whenever you look at anything, especially in the land of YouTube, when we look at things that instantly go wayward, what we instantly see is this instant cracking on of speed, and suddenly things are going 1,000 miles an hour, and you really don't know what actually happened. It actually is said many times inside of those videos where they go, I don't know what happened, man. I just, whatever it is they did or whatever they said.
Well, right.
They literally didn't know what was going on, and it's because everything just accelerated out of control.
Right. That was actually kind of the most.
Don't you wish you had a heart rate monitor on those folks?
Yeah. Yeah.
As in, our heart makes it 160, 180, all everything that's sideways.
That anxiety and emotion does take over, and you can't make great decisions. I mean, sometimes you have to, but it's hard to make good decisions when it's anxiety and emotion that's mixed together. I can tell you when officers go into officer-involved shootings, whether they're hit or struck or not, we take them to the hospital for an assessment. I can tell you the heart rates are off the charts.
Always.
I mean, off the charts. You do not want to be in a shooting. You do not want to be in a lethal force situation. It's very tough. So, and I think Brandon, this is where we go out to the audience and say, what have your experiences been, right?
Yeah.
Go over to blackandbluevoices.com and tell us what your experiences have been, because we want to hear from you. We're going to be bringing other law enforcement leadership and other members of the African-American community and getting different perspectives on this show. But, certainly to our audience, what's your experiences, and tell us how that's gone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with that, I think we can all agree that there's a certain way to behave. But we'd also like to know, is that rooted in fear or respect? Because I think that's important to understand, or both, right? A little bit of both. So I want to go back to something I put a pin in. As we were talking about Philando Castile, we can bring up probably about 150 other names. We live in a very, like the 30-second society, right? Everything's a reel, everything's a clip, everything's a 30-second video. What role, we talk about the word of mouth or the legacy. What role do you think that some of our reporters, politicians, media, what's their responsibility to some of this?
Well, I'm glad you've brought that up, because me and Eric talk at length about painting with a broad brush, and I'm completely opposed to painting with a broad brush, and I try not to do it, but it's hard, right?
Yep.
Society is used to doing that. And when we get with, guys, do you know how it feels to be in a group and then to be painted with a broad brush in that group? I do. I do. You guys know that too?
I'm familiar with that feeling.
Okay, you're familiar with that. Good.
Say the cops hated to be treated like they're black.
So
Because that's what it is.
So we get painted with. So let's start out here. So we have, in police work, we'll have somebody who's a bad actor. We'll have somebody that shouldn't be in police work. They don't have the ethical standards to be in police work. And in my experience, that's not the overwhelming majority of police officers, right?
Yeah.
But that one action, that one incident, that one news story, whatever, that gives people to the opportunity to paint with a broad. Look, this is the problem with policing. It drives me up a wall. We're gonna get on the show our good friend Larry Lawton, who is a convicted felon, turned reformed, did some good things trying to keep kids out of jail and things like that. We're gonna get him on, and me and Larry go back and forth. In fact, we have a podcast called copsandrobberstalk.com. Head over there and check that out. It's a very interesting dynamic. I know you guys have been on the show.
You might see some handsome black men on.
You might see that.
Time or two.
But me and Larry will go back and forth, because Larry will go, well, this is the problem with the cops. I'm like, hold on. And painting with a broad brush. So what I don't want to do, because to further this conversation, what I don't want to do is I don't want to paint with a broad brush, because I have a tendency to go, well, that's because of the media. The media is because you've never seen, you see all the bad interactions with law enforcement, but you don't see the good interactions.
Yeah.
And then what am I doing? I'm painting the media with a broad brush. I know reporters that are ethical. I knew a reporter that one time had I won't go into the details, but had a story, and it was a hot story, and it had information that would have been completely, newsworthy, hot, all that kind of stuff. And they said, if I do that, that's going to hurt this family. And they chose, and their editors and all that chose not to put that out. And I was like, I respect that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear that.
Yeah.
Nobody hears that story. And so when I paint the media with a broad brush and I go, all reporters are bad, the news media, this and that, I want to bring a reporter on the show and go, how's that feel?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's a good point.
Right?
No, that's a great point.
Politicians. I know politicians that have tried to do the right thing, that have helped people, that have had good, but you don't always see. So we're going to bash politicians, right? It's not everybody. So, I will slip up sometime during the course of this show and try, and the brush might get a little broader and Eric will have to stop me. But those are the things that, we want to protect against.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I struggle with this in the same way as you do.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it?
Because I think in order to have a meaningful conversation, we have to make some generalizations. We have to.
Yeah,
To agree on something.
right, with caveats.
We have to, because if we start at the far end and say all media, cops, black people, politicians, insert noun, right?
Right,
They're all X.
right.
That's ridiculous. We can't have a conversation.
Can't have it, right?
But if we go to the far other end and say everybody's an individual and has agency, you can't have a conversation based on that either, because we're talking about groups. So there's a sweet spot in the middle. So I think we'll ask for some grace from our audience, and we're not going to be perfect at it necessarily every time, but we'll reel ourselves in, right? That's our.
Well, I'm sure they'll let us know.
We can talk about actions, though.
Yeah, we can talk about actions. We can talk about behaviors. We can talk about attitudes,
Systems and processes.
and
things
I
like
think
that,
the way I split this baby is when I talk about policing,
Mhm.
I'm talking about mainly leadership, right? Because I think leadership has a responsibility. So one of the things that, and
I agree.
I've had this conversation,
in leadership. Yep.
there are, because Chief's point is there's bad actors in the community, there's bad actors in law enforcement, because humans are human,
Mhm.
right? I think the difference is that I want to be careful as we talk about these things and not make those equivalent, because that's not an equivalent thing, right? Law enforcement is a public trust. Law enforcement is backed with taxpayer dollars. Law enforcement has training requirements. They have leadership. They have unions. They have all this organizational support, billions of dollars nationally, right? That's not the same as individuals being individuals in the community that is not organized in any way. So I want to be careful that we don't draw an equivalence there. Although it's
there's
correct
a
to
difference.
say.
Yeah,
There's a big difference.
Sure.
There. So when I talk about policing or the institution of policing, I'm calling on leadership of policing to make it impossible for a cop who violates somebody's constitutional rights to just go to another department and get a job.
sure.
Right? Like that's a reasonable thing that an organization that is a public trust should be accountable for, right? So I want to make sure, but I'm trying to use the term split that baby. I think it's accurate, right? I want to live in that middle ground where we are talking
Right.
about groups in a responsible way, but not just deferring to sort of individual agencies.
Because really, that's how that breaks down. Me and Eric have talked about this at length. That's how that breaks down. Is once we get to the point where once we get to the point where we can't talk, then we don't make any progress. But the generalization of saying, me and Eric will agree upon things. What we want to get out on this show is, well, what's the truth? What's reality? And when I say police officers and police in general don't want bad actors in their profession, I mean, it's a thing. Some people discount that. Oh, whatever. Well, why does this still happen? Why does that still happen? And I'm telling you, the overwhelming amount of police officers that don't want that. I mean, it's because it and we'll go into that later, but I mean, it stops progress. It stops shows like this. It stops the discussions like this.
Absolutely.
Well, and that's why I'm really focusing in on law enforcement leadership, right? Because the cops on the ground are just people, but they're given the power to arrest, the power to detain. They're given firearms, but who we're giving that power to matters.
And to a point you made earlier, right? If we're going to talk about resolution, we'll use the example of the NFL. You can't say, okay, we're going to fix this by fixing one player, right? You have to talk kind of holistically about the group. So
it's about culture. Yeah, so it's a culture. I mean, yeah, and you set the tone for culture if you're in leadership, and that's important.
So here's my challenge to you guys. I'm going to throw a little fire at you both.
Sure.
That's what we're here for.
We have a systemic issue within the Black community. You keep your mouth shut. You don't snitch. Snitches get stitches. All of that stuff, right? How do we resolve that? Because I feel like in a way we are perpetuating the problem, right? Your neighbor robs an 80-year-old grandma. Well, you can say, hey, it's cool, don't snitch, blah, blah, blah. But what happens when they rob the next neighbor, the next neighbor, the next neighbor? And same thing I'm going to throw to you guys. Feel free to answer as you wish. You often hear about the blue wall of silence or something to that effect. The blue wall, all of this stuff. And I think that's where some people got up in arms with the whole Blue Lives Matter, blue line and all of that. How do you systemically solve for what some people may see as a protection, a systemic protection from the actions of a few? So example, you hear things qualified immunity, you hear, it's just a big fight about what officers can and can't do, what they can be persecuted for or prosecuted for. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, and we can go into depth, and actually, Eric and I are going to bring on a subject matter expert. We have a subject matter expert who's an attorney, who's a friend of ours, who's a constitutional attorney. He can give us in-depth look at qualified immunity and things like that. But kind of in a nutshell, when we talk about, well, first of all, to answer your question, how do you fix that systemic perception and code of silence and things like that? Number one, you talk about it. You're bold and you talk about it. You get on a podcast or whatever it is, and we're doing the show, and we try to break down what's real, and what's not. So, as far as a code of silence, by the way, this is just a shameless plug. If you've not reviewed, Mike and I did a show. We have a podcast called WhatCopsWatch.com. We reviewed the movie Code of Silence, and a lot of that we talked about in there, didn't we, Mike? So
we talked about it in depth. We also talked about it with a self-serving Chicago City cop.
Absolutely.
And if anybody's going to have the gist, it was great because Tommy actually went to the sites that was inside the movie.
Right.
He talked about the things that go on in there and talked deeply about the Code of Silence, which is what the name of that movie is.
Right. And if for people that don't know what the Code of Silence is or whatnot, it's a supposedly a code where if I'm a police officer and you do something wrong, you commit a crime and I'm going to cover it up for you, and so on and so forth. And this is what I'll say in leadership. Look, and because there is a balance. If I have somebody who is a police officer and they're getting ridiculed and persecuted and so forth, and they've done what's right, I'm going to cover them. I'm going to stand. I shouldn't say cover. I'm going to stand up for them.
Okay.
If I have somebody who has done something wrong, I'm not going to stand up for him. I'm not going to cover up for him. There's a difference between standing up for somebody and covering up for somebody. Mm-hmm. Standing up is supporting correct actions and backing people up when they're correct. Covering up is when you conceal something that they've done wrong.
Yes.
And that's what we got to get down to. And when I talk to good police leaders, know that that's the path that they should take, and they do it. They do not cover up for people who've done wrong. And now all the societal pressures, the court of public opinion and the people on social media and all that kind of stuff, does that play into? Yes, that does affect whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And sometimes that doesn't push that in the right direction. So, is it easy to come out and say, hey, look, my officer did something wrong, and you know what? We're going to take corrective action. We're going to do the right thing. And then you do it. No, it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not. It's the right thing to do, but I've seen leaders do that. And then there have been times when leaders haven't done that, right? And you know what?
Yeah.
You'll face the consequences if so. And that's the problem when we have, Eric and I have talked about this. That's the problem when we have these incidents, and these incidents come out on social media, and you'll get a portion of the facts, and then people will just start, they'll just start inserting their own facts, inserting their own circumstances. I always sit back and I go, well, hold on. I need to see all the facts. I need to see everything, right? There's sometimes there's an obvious problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you got a video when somebody's, kneeling on somebody's neck and they die. I get it. I mean, there's a problem there. Let me see all the facts. I'm going to, and I'm going to call it too. I'm going to call it like it is. hey, you know what? That's a crime. You murdered somebody. You committed a homicide. You go to jail. So, and my colleagues in law enforcement will stand up and say that too.
So would you agree with the summation of it's a top-down approach, right? It starts with leadership, emulating, reflecting that.
Yeah,
and then it goes down from there.
It does start from the top down. The reality of, hey, is there a code of silence? There's a difference between a code of silence and professional courtesy. Am I going to deny that if a police officer pulls over another police officer for speeding or not signaling to go into a different lane, they're going to go, oh yeah, I can let you go. I'll give you a verbal warning, this and that. I'm not going to deny that because I'm an honest and truthful person.
And I think many of our listeners would appreciate that honesty. Just even that simple statement.
But hey, you just went and robbed a grocery store at gunpoint. No, you're going to jail. I don't care if you're a cop. You're going to jail. How do I know that? And why do I think that so, when you talk about, the code of silence, no, they can knock off a grocery store. No, they're going to jail. How do I know that? Because I've been there. My department, other police departments in the area have arrested police officers, taken it to court, and prosecuted them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a thing. I mean, it's not, so when you say, hey, your experience with a code of silence, I'm like, there is no code of silence to me in my experiences. Now, if we go back in the past and we go back into historical policing and things like that, I'm not going to deny. Sure, there could have been a code of silence. There were things covered up. There was documented things where, they had police that, committed some horrendous acts and it was covered up and things like that.
Yeah.
It does happen. I go off of my experiences.
Sure.
And that's where
same question about, as I challenged Chief, I do want to challenge you, and I know you're not the talk all be all for Black people, right? But from your perspective, right? You and I have a similar experience of how we were raised, right? I mean, there's some tenets that within the Black community, that's just how you're raised. Not snitching is a huge one. Clearly, it doesn't do any service to policing our communities. Where is that balance, right? Where do you find, how do we improve that, but without maybe taking away the spirit of what that phrase was supposed to mean at one point in time?
As I was listening to Chief, my brain was just churning.
I have that effect.
I mean, because there's a lot to respond to there, and in your question, the thing that jumps out at me the most is when you were talking, I was thinking the code of silence is don't snitch. It's the same stuff, right? Like, and yes, there are examples of cops doing things that are wrong who were fine, right? Like that were protected, right? We'll say covered up. And there are stories of people who did something wrong, got prosecuted for it, got fired, got whatever. But the other thing is, in the course of, I think we have to distinguish between making a mistake at work and trying to get over at work. And I know everybody listening, a lot of y'all are out here trying to get over at work. I'm not gonna lie, right? Everybody, it's a human thing, right? Like we try to cut corners and take shortcuts and this and that, right? I think what the difference is with people in the community, there's a fear of bringing law enforcement in. Okay. Right? Like it's gonna get worse for all of us if we bring law enforcement in. It's also a manipulation tactic by people who do wrong, right? Because fear and intimidation, you talk to Black people in areas of crime, and they are afraid of the drug dealer, the gang members, whatever, right? And they live in fear, right? That goes back to that generational stress.
That
benefits nobody, right? Benefits
the drug dealer or the person doing wrong.
But it doesn't benefit the community, which goes back to my original point that the communities of color need policing more than anybody does. So, but there's also, which group do you fear more? And it's not always the gang. Yeah. Because you know, gangs look out for folks sometimes, right? And it doesn't feel like police based on history, right? So I think it doesn't feel like when you bring police in, nothing, and you know, Black people think when you bring police in, everything gets worse, right? No matter the circumstances. And based on experience, that's legit. So when you talk about not covering up crimes, I mean, that's you. This is why you like you, because you don't do stuff like that.
Well,
But there's a lot of times when you hear about an officer involved shooting that's a little stinky, right? Or somebody violating somebody's civil rights. And then what comes out in the prosecution is, oh, this person had these problems here and here and here, and they were covered up. They were never prosecuted. So that leaves a trail, but it only comes out after there's a critical incident that hits the news or YouTube or whatever, and it forces the hand.
And I think
Take this person out of police.
and could we say that the code of silence or not snitching is produced though? And let's lay it on the table too.
Yeah.
That covers and helps the bad actors.
No doubt.
Anywhere.
No doubt.
Right? That gives them cover, because I can tell you that. You know what else gives them cover? The division.
Yeah.
Because if I'm a bad actor in law enforcement and I want to take your attention, and I'm not the majority, right? The majority isn't. The majority, and this is my experience, the majority of police officers are not the bad actor, but the bad actor that's in there that I want to get rid of as a police leader, that I don't want in my profession, if they continue to prosper the division and go, see, it's not me, it gives them cover, and then it takes all the focus off of them. If I'm the drug dealer and I continue the division, it gives me cover to where and that's why we're here.
Yeah.
To undo
Correct.
that premise. We talk about, even within law enforcement, we break it down, Eric, from police leadership, because I can tell you there's like, hey, how about police reform? Let's do police reform. And Larry Lawton will disagree. I remember I had this discussion with him. You're not going to legislate. Eric might disagree with me too. You're not going to legislate bad behavior out of law enforcement. It's, it comes down past leadership. It comes down to that police officer, that leader setting the tone, and that police officer going, hey, no, that's not in my culture, not in my family. We don't do that. That's what it takes to change. It's the same thing, I think, in community. If the majority of community rises up and goes, no, we're not going to put up with that, community will change it. I can tell you,
You're right.
if I have a law, an ordinance, I'll give you an example. It's simplistic. It was illegal to shoot fireworks off on the 4th of July. Well, if I have 20,000 people in my city and 80% of them want to shoot fireworks off, guess who's not going to stop them? 40 cops. Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think I agree, you can't legislate out bad behavior, but you can legislate accountability for bad behavior. And that's what people are asking for. But
We're putting some things in place. But yeah, when changing the culture has
but
to
it has to be enforced.
But
I think
go for it.
let me throw this point out, because I want to hear what you have to say about it. The problem is that police do not have the benefit of the doubt among minorities. And it's earned.
Huh.
And you talked about history.
Yep.
And I think one of the things that's missing is that, and I know I feel like this, and I didn't grow up with some of these issues, right? So I can only imagine how it sounds to somebody who lived it. You know what I mean? But, and like Brandon said, I'm not the spokesperson for all Black people. Thank you for saying that. I meant to say that at the top, right? These are my opinions.
Yes.
But we
By the
we
way,
can all
Chris-
have one experience.
By the way, Christy Giuseppe represents every single police area who has strengths.
They're always stabbing me through the heart with that. Thank you.
But it's a credibility issue. And I know that, and particularly through 2020, and I had a lot of conversations with family members and friends, it's like, I feel like I have been gaslighted gaslighted, right? Is there
Close enough.
Sure. Somebody else lets you know I use language for a living. I've been gaslighted into thinking that none of that stuff happened, or that was in the past. Like, we can get rid of it. Like, we just spent 15 minutes talking about the impact of those histories. And to not have anybody, it feels like people go out of their way in the support of law enforcement, which I don't know that law enforcement wants, but in the support of law enforcement, they go so far out of their way to deny or minimize the impacts of all that stuff. And that makes people of color feel like so everything that happened, you can't clean slate this stuff. So having an acknowledgement that like, okay, that was then and you just did it, right? Some of this stuff may have happened in the past, but today here's how we're approaching it. I think there's value in that.
I caveat
There's
it with,
value in that.
I caveat everything with, these are my experiences and this is what based on, but it might not be, I mean, I'm not saying that that's, that's the way it is across the board. What I think what you're saying is there is a history, and listening to how we got here is important to community. Listening to
Tell me, I don't need to worry about this.
And I
Seeing all the stuff in the past.
contextualize some of this too, though, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that it would be disingenuous, not that anyone's trying to do this, for us to argue that every bad encounter with a police officer or with the community is someone shot. It could be as simple as,
right.
like, how I feel on stop and frisk. It could be as simple as having your car torn apart. It could be as simple as them running from the police officer and the cop fell down a ditch and bumped his knee and now he's got knee pain for the rest of his life.
Right.
So I think that the context of this, and you actually hit it really, really well on the head, is that, I hate this term, the microaggressions, whether it's towards police officers or towards the community, I think those build on that history that may not be relevant today, or it might not be happening today. I wouldn't say relevant, might not be happening today. But if I hear stories on that 16-year-old, I hear stories, I get pulled over a first time, my car's tossed, they're throwing everything out of it. That builds a mindset, I think, with some people, of, well, and I hate to F the police, right? That's where you hear some of that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to actually give you guys just a really funny story, and then, sorry to cut you off, I'll give you guys a second, and then I want to move to final thoughts. In my neighborhood, I live out in Troy, and we don't see cops very often. Maybe three black people in my entire neighborhood, including me, a couple hundred people. I find it somewhat hilarious to me that some of my neighbors, we all kind of get together here and there. When we see a cop rolling down our street, my white neighbors are the first ones to go, what are they doing here? Right? And it's not a race.
Well, that's
Well, but no,
yeah, we'll go into that.
The small town.
well, but that's what I'm pointing out is I think that holistically, maybe the perception of policing, right, or some of the interactions that have been passed down, whether we talk about media, politicians, grandstanding, I think there is a perception from policing and from the community, from both sides, that I think needs to be rectified.
Yeah, and it's defensive posturing that disable the conversation.
Yeah.
And that's why, because you're going to go, well, wait a minute. Historically, this is what happened, and look what the police did, and this and that and other thing. And I'm going to go, oh, well, Eric, I wasn't policing back in 1950. Right? I wasn't alive, and that's why
You were. Stop lying to me.
see how he
You were 21 back then.
see how he is.
He was policing at then.
And that shuts the conversation down. And so what I've done, and believe me, this has not been easy. It's been hard. It's probably been hard for him too, right? It's hard conversation. But what I've done is said, okay, well, tell me about that. Educate me on that. Tell me about that. Let me hear it. I hear you. I listen. I believe the history and the stories that you've told me and stuff like that. I believe it. But you recognize the police officers, modern day police officers, the people that I work around haven't done that, haven't participated in that. And he'll say, yeah, of course not. Yeah. And I'll also say, well, Eric, how do I undo the sins of the past or the problems of the past or the people that I wasn't even affiliated with? And really, it's not just law enforcement asking that. It's other communities asking that too, right? It's society asking that.
Yeah.
But they're going to get too defensive. They're going to shut down the conversation. To your point with your story, I want to highlight something a little bit behind the scenes in law enforcement. Because we get complaints all the time. I've not seen a cop in my neighborhood for whatever. I'm like, well, we've come through your neighborhood. You must not have been looking out the window.
Looking out the window.
Or 20%, right. So, but the other thing I tell them too is, we go where we have problems too. So if we're not in your neighborhood, that's actually a good thing.
Yes.
Because you're not getting we only have so many police officers, and we put those police officers in areas where we're going to have issues, and that's what we concentrate on.
So before you respond, I just want to talk about, you just nailed you hit the nail right on the head when like we have these conversations. You're like, I get it. Nobody, I won't say nobody again, broad brush. I'm reeling myself in.
Yeah.
But the national discourse is not that. And that's what, if you talk to a therapist and they would tell you that if somebody does something wrong, it's virtually, I don't want to say virtually impossible. It's very difficult to regain trust unless you account.
Mhm.
Unless you say, I did this, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I'll do better in the future. And like those are the 4 pieces that you have to have in order to clear the table. But what's happening with this conversation is people, and I'm using air quotes here, people, not necessarily people inside law enforcement, a lot of people outside of law enforcement, some politicians, they just want to wipe all that away without acknowledging, yeah, this wasn't always on the up and up, right?
Right.
And what you do really well, which is why I still talk to you about these things, is you're like, yeah, I get that. Like I acknowledge that that's a problem. And but how do I
Today.
get past it? And I don't think the people of color are saying that every cop is that. What we're saying is, I don't know which cops are that.
That's a good point.
And when you have a system, when you have individuals with this much power over you, when they show up, how much variance, put yourself in that situation, how much variance is acceptable in the types of people that you have?
And let's hit on to why would I be hesitant to go back and go, hey, well, like I said, first of all, I wasn't there back in the 1950s or whatever it was, whatever we're talking about historically. And is there a fix to it? And you'll say, yeah, just listen. Let's talk about it. Don't deny that, bad things happen or whatever. And I think law enforcement is to the point where, yeah, we're ready to do that. But there's a risk. I'm going to try to paint it for you guys. We're under the microscope all the time, right? Me coming on this show and even talking about this is probably against the grain. So if you're under the microscope, yes, well, I mean, kind. If you're, no, I'm telling you, there are other leaders that'll come on and do this. You'll see, but you're under the microscope all the time. Everybody's ready to light you up on everything. And it's not just police. I mean, this is social media. This is how the world is, right? You're going to cross the line and all of a sudden we're just going to light you on fire. There's a real hesitancy to go, hey, you know what? I want to hear that story. I want to hear that history. I want to understand the thought process. So it's easier just to go, no, I can't. But let me just block you out. You know what happens? Nothing.
So I want to move, sorry, Mr. Alexander, I'm going to move to final thoughts. But I do want to hear from our audience as well.
That's another episode we need to talk, or we need to dig into that.
How do we create the environment within ourselves every day, with our interactions with others, social media, whatever it may be? How do we foster this environment to have these conversations? Honest conversations, open conversations, accountable conversations.
Well, we go over to blackandbluevoices.com and we fill in our audience, and they give us feedback on how we do that, because, as smart as Eric Alexander is and everybody else in this room, I've found out if you reach out to a bigger audience, you oftentimes get a lot of good thought process. I don't know.
I love it. All right, I'm going to go to Mr. Mike Wilkerson, our wonderful producer, for his final thoughts here.
I think I would compare a lot of what we're talking about to mowing your lawn, if you have a lawn nowadays.
I love random stuff like that. Tell me more, sir.
Here's the context. Everyone thinks, wow, man, look at my lawn. God damn, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I did such a great job, or I paid the right guy to get my lawn mowed. That's awesome. The problem is that it's not going to stay that way forever. And it takes upkeep, and it takes vigilance. And whenever you start evoking the word vigilance, the answer is it's never temporary. You have to keep doing it. And it's why the last 10 years that I've been interacting with Chris and Lieutenant Pat and all the other cops that I interact with, is that all of those people are on the path to making sure that what Chris and all of those other people that we'll always talk about are doing is ongoing vigilance to make sure that there is that integrity piece that needs to be in policing. It has to be in policing. It has to not only be in policing, but it has to lead the way in policing. And it's not attrition, but again, it's where people that don't follow the integrity line, they very often find themselves out, which leads directly to what Eric is talking about when they just glom onto another agency.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, though, is vigilance is not temporary.
Yep.
It's an ongoing process that must be fostered.
Next time I'm saving you for last. That was
Man, those are great.
Point.
I'm like, where's he going with this lawn thing? All right, you talking about?
Chief. Kick it over to you.
You know, the main reason that we wanted to put this thing together was to have those conversations. And my passion is to bring people behind the badge, to bring people into law enforcement for the thought process, for the I don't know, the conversations, things that we can educate the public on, because I think we come back to what's reality and what's not. And what we're trying to accomplish here, what Eric and I are trying to accomplish here is breaking down what's real and what's not. And that's why we want to take people behind the scenes, get people into the thought process. And we want to gather thought processes from our audience, from society, to find out if what's real and what's not real.
Yeah.
If we can continue to foster that environment and foster that direction and culture, then we can get somewhere. It's just that I've been doing this for 34 years, and I'm just tired of not getting anywhere. And I think that it's time to change that. And I know people, and Eric, well, that's just you. No, it's not just me. I'm telling you, my profession, the leadership in my profession want to bond with community. They want to have these discussions. They want to move forward. And, our success depends on it.
I'm going to make one comment on what you just said, and then I'm going to get into my closing thoughts, which is I'm going to quote Robert Montgomery Knight, former coach of Indiana, who said, do you have the will to win? I'm paraphrasing here. Do you have the will to win, or do you have the will to prepare to win? And the point is that the actual doing of the thing is much more difficult than wanting the thing, right? So like you make the point that leadership in law enforcement's ready for this, right?
Uh-huh.
I think and you can, maybe on another episode we can go deeper into this, but as it appears to me, they haven't been ready to deal with that pushback, right? Because every progress always has pushback.
It's hard,
right?
yeah.
So are we ready for that? Are we ready to roll up the sleeves and deal with the discomfort of doing it? And I think that's what it is. But to address the question you asked, Brandon, which was, how do we bridge all this, right? Basically, that's your question, right? How do we, I think it lies in humanizing people that we may not have anything in common with.
Agreed.
And we started off the pod and we talked a lot about statistics on divorce and the impact of stress and epigenetics and all this stuff. And I think it starts by realizing that dude or that woman who's pulling me over we keep using that example because it's simple, right?
Yeah.
They feel just shit about this as I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
That's
And like,
perspective.
we're both under stress. So let's, I like the way Mike put it, slow everything down. And we both teach response to violence, right? And dealing with adrenal stress is part of that. We do it at an extreme level.
Dude, it's mental muscle memory.
It's huge, right?
Mental muscle memory is something I think 98% of America and the world doesn't really take to heart.
Yes. Yeah.
You think it's just a paragraph in a book. You think it's just a short 20-minute story your mom's going to tell you about insert whatever the experience is. That's not it. Yeah. There's, again, just a quick aside. I took an anti-carjacking class. And the whole context of taking an anti-carjacking class, beyond me driving one of the world's most stolen cars, beyond my wife being deaf, beyond my daughter being autistic, is that I can, and I have a really good imagination. You guys all know this. I can spool all day long about the different things that might happen. But until I'm in the situation and actually experiencing it, I have no idea how I'm going to react. And so I took that class and I took the 3 scenarios that were thrown at me at random. And I now have at least something tangible
Mhm.
that has nothing to do with my skill sets of either grabbing, maneuvering, or using my firearm. It has nothing to do with that. It's what are you going to do when something happens?
Yes.
And so the mental muscle memory, we're going to be, I hope that we just bring that up all the time inside of our discussions, because it really is, we can talk about things all day long, but until you actually get in them and inside of the conversations like the ones we have here, it's not going to matter.
Well, it's funny you bring up force on force training because I've done a fair amount of it, and there's nothing more humbling. You think you're good, man. You think you're good. But then when something plays out, you're good inside the structure of a drill. But when stuff starts getting thrown against the wall, are you still good? But I think this conversation making real progress on this requires everyone to humble themselves.
Yes.
It requires people in the community to say, all right, am I brave enough to trust?
Right.
It requires law enforcement to say, guys, we haven't been very good at this we haven't been very good at interacting with the community. We need to acknowledge that these things happen and stop lying about, not police aren't lying, but people who are lying, because people are out here lying and covering up the truth and trying to clear the table without acknowledging, hey, this was
It's the game.
big deal.
This was
You need to humble yourself to do it, right?
Yes.
And I think we all need to do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to close this out by just saying how grateful we all are, right, for this opportunity to speak with each other.
Amen.
To have this platform, to have the feedback from our listeners, to have them thinking about how they can affect this change in their lives every day. So I think if I can leave you guys with one final thought, it's grateful, truly grateful.
Agreed. Absolutely.
I love it.
So until next time, I'm your host, one of your hosts, Chief Chris DiGiuseppe.
greatest chiefs in City Bowl.
We're gonna come up with nicknames for everybody too. Alexander the Great.
That's the laziest nickname of all time.
We're good.
All right. Thank you. Make sure to check out blackandbluevoices.com. You'll get a lot more of this context. What's the word I'm saying? Context. There you go.
There you go.
Been using a lot of words today. They used up.
I'm on.
You guys have yourselves a great morning, afternoon, and evening. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Thanks for listening. Want more content? Check us out at blackandbluevoices.com.